Our pre-training wellness questionnaire is adapted from the work of McLean in rugby league. We ask the players a number of times a week to rate fatigue, sleep, soreness, stress and illness on a very simple scale where 4 is normal and 1 terrible and 7 is excellent. We've tried to use terms that are meaningful to the players, and interestingly we've even thought about varying those terms just to keep the guys switched on and so that they don't go into autopilot with their reporting. And I'll talk you through in a little while how we analyse all of this statistically to try and pick up some of the changes in status. Sorry. One of the other things that we do subjectively when people rate their sleep poorly is we've just started on using some actigraphs to monitor sleep quality. And the purpose of this is to get some more objective measures on how the players are sleeping and allow us to provide some education to optimise what we believe is probably, along with nutrition, the 2 most important things to optimise training. Session RPE I've explained a little bit and everybody's very, very familiar with it. The one thing that we do that might be slightly different to others is we do calculate monotony and strain as well as just multiplying session RPE by minutes to calculate load. We find that that can provide some real insight. We've found over the last number of years that players can tolerate really high training loads as long as there's variation. But if there's a low variation which gives you a high monotony, ultimately a very high strain, and that tends to be the thing that we find AFL athletes struggle to cope with. On a less regular basis, we also utilise an athlete distress questionnaire. This is an inventory developed by Luana Main from University of Western Australia, one of Brian Dawson's students. It's a 22-item questionnaire which assesses depression, vigour, physical symptoms, sleep, stress and fatigue. We don't use that as regularly, but we find this is also a very insightful tool which again drives further intervention from designated people if we find there's a problem. So that's the combination of items that we use subjectively and objectively to monitor the training load and the fatigue response to that load in our system. What I'd like to do now is just take you through how we put that all together. So this is a typical weekly in-season schedule in the AFL. It's a 7-day cycle, which, as I've mentioned, it could be anywhere between 6 and 10, but for the sake of this presentation, if we have a match on day 1, we typically follow on day 2 with a hydrotherapy-based recovery day. We tend to do some training on the next day, also some flexibility or yoga and a strength training session. There's a requirement in the AFL. We have a very strong players' union, and there's an agreement that we have to provide them with 1 full day off during the season. For us, that's a rotating day, which provides its own issues as far as load management and fatigue monitoring go. Day 5 would generally be a training session and also another flexibility or yoga and second strength training session. The day before a match, a very light training session, and then the match again. If we have a look at the way we slot our fatigue monitoring into this system, load monitoring into this weekly cycle, the red circles depict where we would collect our wellness questionnaire, so 3 to 4 times a week depending on the length of the cycle. We collect our neuromuscular fatigue and salivary cortisol after the day off and always 96 hours post-match, because we know that both neuromuscular fatigue and salivary cortisol should be back to baseline at that point. There's no point in collecting at day 2 because all we're going to find is that surprise, surprise, there's a problem. So we collect it when we expect that it should be back to baseline. We collect session RPE after everything that we do. every physical training session that we do. And then we collect the athlete distress questionnaire on a monthly basis. It's by no means the perfect system, but with the resources we have and the combination of objective and subjective tools, it seems to fit reasonably well at this point. So the graph I'm going to show you now, data from the 2010 season. It was an interesting season because, to put it plainly, we were terrible. We finished 14th, I think. The one thing that has gone our way over the last 2 years, even though the performances haven't been great, is that we've had a fairly good run with games lost due to injury. The first trace there looks at weekly strain across the 22-week season. I've divided it by 10, so it fits on the slide well. You can see that there's two really distinct points of high strain that are sort of out of proportion to the rest of the year. And unfortunately, these coincided with prior to this, some really poor performances, and that drove our coaching group to probably implement a training load that was a bit outside of necessarily of the plan. The second line, the blue one, unfortunately the scale doesn't quite do it justice, but that's our neuromuscular fatigue across the season, and that actually ranges anywhere from about 77 to 112% of baseline. So the variations are well outside the 8% CV of the test, and that's probably the important thing. The green line here represents salivary cortisol. There's much bigger fluctuation in the cortisol across the season. We think you can explain this by the fact that it's a relatively blunt instrument, so it's going to respond not only to physical stress but psychological stress. And unfortunately, if you'd been at our club over the past year, there was a fair deal of stress associated with the poor performance and selection and where the whole organisation was heading. So there may be some of that reflected in that response. What's probably the most interesting is the wellness response to that strain. And what we see is that there's almost a lag effect of a really high strain being followed by wellness plummeting. And those 2 periods I mentioned, really high strain, wellness through the floor, really high strain, wellness through the floor. And what was really interesting is that we found we actually didn't recover our athletes after this last really hard training week. And in that week it was quite interesting. There was 6 a.m. boxing sessions, there was 6 a.m. down at the beach, for potentially very good reasons, but it certainly appears that had a fairly detrimental physical effect. So one of the most important things we think in collecting all this data is analysing it appropriately and making sense of it. So we look at it firstly on an acute basis. So our biomarkers and performance measures, we compare against the baseline based on the CV of the test. And we think that's really important, that we're sure that there's a biological response and it's not just the error in the test. The other critical thing we find there is establishing a baseline, because what you compare it to will have a really big impact on whether there's a change. And we now calculate our baseline during our pre-season cup. So we play a 4-week pre-season cup before round 1 of the official AFL season. And we believe that's a reasonable baseline. We've done some work where we've compared it immediately to a baseline calculated from when the players have returned from a break, but it's not really representative. So what you find when you compare to that is that, of course, all of your results suggest that your players are in trouble, and they're not. It's just that the baseline is artificially high. But our subjective markers require a little bit more thought. And what we've taken to doing is using the standard difference score. And there's an article in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research by Petit in 2010. It's effectively a Z score of the difference between 2 different points. And so we look at that both on an individual acute level, and we look at it on an individual acute level compared to the group acute change. Because whilst we want to look individually and see whether a person's changed to what they normally might rate, if they've changed in one way but the whole group's changed in another way, even if they're coming up as not changed to normal, we might want to investigate that further. So it might indicate, well, hang on, this guy's changing or reporting in a different way to the rest of the group. You might have had a recovery group and everyone else has improved, but this guy's stayed where he was. So you need to be able to pick that up. As well as assessing acutely, we also think it's really important to look on a more chronic level at what's happening. So again, the biomarkers and performance measures are compared to the baseline relative to the CV, but here we use a 4-week rolling average to give us a little bit of an idea of a more longer term trend. Subjectively, we use the same calculation, but again, instead of utilising the score at that particular time point, we use the 4-week rolling average. And we find that this is really useful because you'll see from that wellness inventory that if someone rates 4 off, 4 is normal, if they rate themselves as a 5 most of the time and suddenly rate 4, if you just used the raw score, you wouldn't pick that up as a problem because it's still normal. But if you have a statistical technique that allows you to determine that that's actually different than what they normally rate, that should probably raise a red flag for you. So at the pointy end of all of that is the interpretation. And we ask ourselves some very simple questions. Is there a change? Is it acute, chronic, or both? Is it subjective, objective, or both? Importantly, is there a performance decrement? That's really what it comes down to. And maybe there's a change in body composition or work output as measured by our GPS variables. And we only use 2 GPS variables, the ones that we've demonstrated to be valid and reliable. So that's total distance or metres a minute in relative terms, and high intensity total distance or high intensity metres a minute. And then really critically, are there any additional considerations? So training age, injury history, recent workload, personal issues. We can sometimes forget that these athletes aren't robots, that they have personal things going on. And recently we had an athlete who just became a father for the first time. And we had to take that into account in interpreting his reporting, and his cortisol went through the roof. Then it's all about making a qualitative inference on the combined importance of the individual markers. So when you put them all together, what does it mean? What's the message for what we should do with this athlete? And that leads us to an intervention. So, of course, it's about developing a training plan, but before you do that, perhaps you should talk to the athlete. What's going on? We're noticing this. These markers are suggesting these things. How do you feel about that? We may modify our load. Now that might be an increase or a decrease. It might be a different training stress than the majority of the group. We might institute different recovery and nutritional interventions. As I said, we're fortunate to have a full-time performance dietitian, so that forms basically the platform of everything that we do. We might send the player for more physio or medical treatment or assessment. And then, of course, potentially further investigation, which may involve something like a blood screen. It might be a scan for who knows what. And then ultimately provide advice to the coaches. And I couldn't agree with Nick Gill more. Ultimately, that's what we need to do. Sometimes it's not going to go the way that we think it might go, and the coaches have got different reasons for making decisions that they have to make based on the needs of the program.